Welcome to Avatar State of Mind, a podcast exclusively dedicated to the universe of Avatar The Last Airbender. From The Last Airbender to The Legend of Korra, the comic books, the Kyoshi novels, this is your number one stop for Avatar content. My name is Sam DeCoste, and I'm joined by Aaron Miller to spend the next 30 minutes with you talking about the Avatar universe. From the Northern Water Tribe to Ba Sing Se and Zuko's honor, of course, we've got you covered. This is Avatar State of Mind. Welcome back to Avatar State of Mind. This is Sam DeCoste speaking. We're at episode 6 already. This is Aaron Miller next to me. Aaron, how's it going?
It's going really good, Sam. I'm very excited for this episode. It's the first one that we are recording at nighttime, so the mood in this room right now is much different than previous episodes.
It is, and it's appropriate that we set the tone because these two episodes really set book one into high gear, and I'm really excited about it. So let's just get right into it, shall we?
Yeah, let's go.
So, this is Avatar State of Mind. We're continuing our series-long recap of Avatar The Last Airbender by spending each podcast talking about individual chapters. We'll break down every chapter of Avatar in order from books 1 to 3, from The Boy in the Iceberg to Sozin's Comet. Previously on Avatar State of Mind, we talked about the King of Omashu and Imprisoned. Next up, we're talking about the first two-parter in the series, episodes 7 and 8, The Winter Solstice, Part 1, The Spirit World, and Part 2, Avatar Roku. Before you listen any longer, let this be your spoiler warning. Do not listen to the show today unless you have watched the first 8 episodes of Avatar The Last Airbender. Ideally, the whole series would be great, but if you watch the first 8 episodes, that'll do just fine for this episode recap of the series. So, let's get right into it. Let's talk about Part 1 of The Winter Solstice, The Spirit World. This is our first proper introduction to the Spirit World and a different side of Aang as the Avatar. The episode starts off pretty innocently with Aang cloud surfing, trying to see what clouds are made of. Then they see this burned forest scattered with Fire Nation rubble, showing evidence that a Fire Nation army destroyed a forest right near a village. And Aang realizes that there's nobody who can teach him how to be the Avatar, that there are things like this, a burned down forest that he doesn't know how to fix, and he wished he was there to help, and now this whole forest burned down. And then the village comes by, requesting for Aang's help, and the legend says that Heibai, the black and white spirit, is coming every night and abducting one of the villagers every single day and attacking the village and destroying buildings and wreaking havoc everywhere. And it's the first introduction to the spirit world and suggesting that on the solstice in 72 hours, the human world and spirit world will be completely blurred. And it refers to Aang as the great bridge between the two worlds. This shows that being the Avatar is more than mastering the elements. It's also a connection to the spirits, which is something that we did not know existed before this episode.
And this episode is just so deep, not even 5 minutes into it. I mean, it started super slow, showing the Fire Nation bird and then Appa flying above it in the clouds, and of course, Aang cloud surfing. But then it immediately, like you said, goes right into the death that we see in this burned down forest. And I believe this episode 7 of book 1, is exactly where in the entire series it flips from being this children's show where these characters are just having fun to this super, super in-depth storyline that any people of any age could really enjoy.
So then Aang sticks around to try and help the villagers even though he has no clue what he's supposed to do. We see this giant black and white monster with long legs, 4 arms. He storms in and screams. When he screams, he transmits blue light out of his mouth, and it goes and destroys whatever it's screaming at. And he can transport between areas without walking over. He's got big long legs. He destroys the town, and he takes Sokka when Sokka tries to take initiative and help Aang, who doesn't know what he's doing. And then Aang falls down right in front of a panda statue in the middle of the burned forest. And that's where he enters the spirit world for the first time. And then Roku sends his dragon to find Aang and take him to the Fire Nation. And then he discovers he can speak to Avatar Roku on the solstice, where he will tell Aang about a comet, which you learn more about later. I want to talk about Uncle Iroh for a second, because this episode does give Iroh significant more backstory than we originally thought. He goes from being a lazy old man heating his own pool with his fire breath in the forest to a retired and once great General Iroh and the Dragon of the West. Aaron, do you want to talk about him a little bit and his backstory?
Yeah, I honestly, out of these two episodes, yes, they're both very significant, but I think the backstory that the creators gave Iroh is the most important part of both these episodes. Simply because, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but as soon as Roku sends the dragon and the dragon takes Aang on it, and they fly above the Earth Kingdom soldiers who captured Iroh, Iroh notices the dragon in the spirit world. So, like you said, the beginning of this episode showed Iroh lounging around, heating the pool he was in by himself, and then all of a sudden he's captured, and we see that he's probably one of the most important characters in this entire show. Because, first of all, he laid siege to Ba Sing Se for 600 days. And
that's almost 2 years.
Yeah, and I believe the Earth Kingdom soldiers asked Iroh why he stopped. And Iroh said, oh, I got lonely, I have to go back to my family. But later on in Book 2, he realized because his son actually died, which is so significant. But I just can't get over the fact that Iroh saw the spirit of Roku's dragon, Fang, and this honestly is never really touched upon again until the Legend of Korra. Like, they leave this alone for how many books? Two and a half, and then 1.5 in Korra. It's crazy.
It's very neglected, and it seems, in retrospect, it's very insignificant, but it shows in episode 7 where Iroh was not really given any character development whatsoever. You see them talk about Iroh as a once great general who's somehow miraculously connected to the spirits in a way that Katara is not, that Sokka's not, that Zuko is not, the Earth Kingdom soldiers are not. And so it really gives Iroh some depth that he didn't really have. Also, I wish, and I'm sure you share this desire, that they dressed Iroh, that he wasn't just wearing some shorts during this whole occasion. It was a little disturbing, and Zuko almost saw him, without any clothes on, and that made for a really funny scene as well.
Yeah, I was shocked seeing that, but I think I was also more shocked that Iroh was established as he had more connection to the spirit world than Aang did. Like, honestly, because Iroh was able to see this dragon without any teaching that we saw. Obviously, he might have had teaching before this. I think it would have been amazing to have, because Aang kept saying in this episode he needed a teacher to teach him through the spirit world, and obviously he found that through Roku a little bit. It would have been fantastic for Iroh to teach Aang about the spirit world. I don't know what you think about that.
I totally agree. And as you alluded to, he has a very prominent role in the Legend of Korra as a spiritual mentor to Korra, and that would have been a very, very nice partnership, connection that Aang and Iroh could have had, because they never really connected on a level like that, which would have been very cool. Also, Iroh shows he's very clever when he leaves his sandal behind for Zuko to track him. That's something that you might not expect from some old man who's not been known at this point to move around very much.
And can we just point out that when Zuko is going after Iroh on top of the rhino, he sees Appa, and I mean, obviously he can't tell who's on Appa. It was only Katara, so it wouldn't have been that significant, but he noticed it, and he decided to go after Iroh instead of continuing after the Avatar. I believe Zuko even said the Avatar, and then he turned back around and went after his uncle, which shows how much of a connection he has with him. Iroh is such a father figure to him, and even though Zuko somewhat neglects him throughout this entire series, deep down, Zuko really, really cares about his uncle.
And Zuko manages to help Iroh and single-handedly defeat the Earth Kingdom soldiers when he does find him. And also, Zuko keeps that sandal the whole show. He keeps it all the way until the series finale, which comes in handy very much so as the series comes to an end. And as you said, Iroh miraculously seeing Aang riding Roku's dragon, And then after Aang in a spiritual journey, he goes over to the Crescent Island in the Fire Nation where Roku called home for many years. and he learns that he has a few days to go to the Fire Nation and meet Roku on the solstice, in the temple, in the sanctuary, and he has to go to the Fire Nation. So we learned about that. And then he's taken back to the village where Heibai is invading, and then somehow it clicks in his head when he wakes up from his spiritual journey, when he's waking up at the panda statue, that Heibai is the panda spirit, and his spirit roams the forest, which was just burned down. And he's able to help Heibai, who, once we realize why Heibai is invading, you can see Heibai panting in his breath, almost in angst and pure tiredness. You could see that he's visually devastated, that his home was destroyed. And Aang manages to cheer him up by showing him the acorn that Katara showed him earlier in the episode, that all the acorns will one day be big oak trees and the forest will grow back. And that is what sends Heibai away in peace and frees the villagers, including Sokka. I find it very fascinating that spirits, they have earthly homes in addition to homes in the spirit world.
Yeah, and what you just said is further established in the Kyoshi novels with one of the very, very significant spirits that actually played a big part in Avatar: The Last Airbender, the series, and The Legend of Korra, and the comic books. It's brought up in the Kyoshi novels, and I mean, it's never brought up in the series, but it's always in the background. I don't want to get into it too much, maybe a future episode. But I think, do you remember when Aang touched Heibai on the head and basically calmed him down? That comes from when Fang did the same thing with like his whiskers or whatever and touched Aang. It shows how much Aang, he's a very good learner. He picks things up quickly. He understands that the connection between him and the spirits isn't just like this fake bridge. I'm putting bridge in quotes. It's about the physical connection. So when he touched the spirit, they had a much more intimate and like experience where they could actually understand each other.
Also, I'm a little curious why Heibai was attacking the village when it looks to be clear that the Fire Nation burned the forest down, but Heibai is taking out his rage on this village, who probably did not burn the forest down. I'm kind of curious about that.
I think I might have an answer to it. Do you remember when, at the end of the very, very end of this episode, right before the credits, you see Zuko running into the village and busting like the leader of the village out, saying, "Where did the Avatar go?" And then you immediately, the next episode, you immediately see Zuko following the Avatar. So that means that this village told Zuko where the Avatar was going. I think if you link that back to the village itself with the Fire Nation, I think that the village wasn't against the Fire Nation. I think they're very neutral in everything. They were never fighting the Fire Nation. They were never against them. So when the Fire Nation actually burned down the forest, they didn't fight back, and they allowed it to happen. So since the Fire Nation is gone, I think Heibai thinks that these people played a part in it.
That's interesting. I never thought of it like that. They were not necessarily on a side in the war, because you assume every Earth Kingdom village is against the Fire Nation, but maybe not. But it prepares a very fascinating and intriguing cliffhanger that Aang needs to get to Crescent Island in the Fire Nation in 24 hours to speak to his predecessor to discover what he has to do as the Avatar. So then we go into part 2, Avatar Roku. Now, Aang initially was going to leave without Sokka and Katara, and Appa refused to take off without them. And that's interesting as well, because Appa, obviously, as a Sky Bison, with Aang, they have a very strong connection. But even with Sokka and Katara, who at this point, he's probably known for maybe a week, maybe a little more than a week, yet Appa is already so tightly bonded with Sokka and Katara, he refuses to leave without them. This is also a point where Aang notches up his intensity. Before this point, Aang's really just been some goofy 12-year-old kid who has powers beyond anybody's discretion. Yet, now Aang has a mission. He has a real mission. It's a change of pace from goofing off on Omashu and riding the Elephant Koi by Kyoshi Island. He has a mission now, and he is committed to making sure he gets to Roku by the solstice. So then, Appa and gang fly into Fire Nation waters. And Zuko is on a suicide mission, and Iroh knows it. Zuko is sailing into a Fire Nation blockade led by Commander Zhao. And Zuko so shamelessly and so short-sightedly just goes headfirst into this blockade, risking his freedom in the process.
And a very, very important part of this episode and the previous episode that I thought was just fantastic is the way that the creators made it so both of these episodes wasn't Aang's story and it also wasn't Zuko's story. It was both. Everything was linked hand in hand. Every single scene in the previous episode went one after the other, back and forth, especially in this one. It's like when Aang is flying on Appa with Katara and Sokka and he sees the blockade, Aang says, there's just one little problem, and then it shifts directly to Zuko, and Zuko says, a blockade. So even though Zuko and Aang aren't with each other, Zuko finished Aang's sentence. So it shows that even though they're enemies, they're very similar and they think the same way.
It also shows Commander Zhao's sheer power in numbers, how he has this massive Fire Nation blockade, unleashing his navy's power by firing at Appa and even almost destroying Zuko's ship, because they were at the end of many of those fireballs and they had to stop for repairs, but Zuko said, do not stop this ship. And then after an epic combat sequence where Aang on Appa with Katara and Sokka somehow make it past the Fire Nation blockade and get into the Fire Nation, you see Zhao allowing Zuko to pass by the blockade, with Zuko risking his freedom and surely would have been arrested if Zhao did not have the mindset to let him pass. Iroh realizes what Zhao's up to. Zhao doesn't know where the Avatar is going. He wants to get the Avatar, so he lets Zuko take him right there. And then Zuko tries to outsmart Zhao with a boat trail as Iroh leads the ship wayward as a decoy. But even Zhao doesn't fall for that. Zhao is such a very intelligent military mastermind throughout this whole first season.
Every single time I watch this episode, I see how much larger Zhao's ships are than Zuko's ships. Zuko's ship is like a quarter of the size. It's not that significant, but it really amazes me. But this scene also makes me wonder, what do you think would have happened in the rest of this episode if Iroh was with Zuko in the temple fighting Zhao and like capturing the Avatar?
Well, Iroh and Zuko would have made it to the temple, into the sanctuary. I don't know. It's hard to factor Iroh into that equation, what role he plays. What do you think? Have you thought about that?
Well, obviously Iroh isn't really with Zuko on it. Like he doesn't really want to capture the Avatar as much as Zuko does, but he's with him on the mission. But honestly, a master firebender with Zuko, he might have turned the tide when they were firebending at Roku when he was coming out of the temple. I don't know if Iroh could have turned the tides and even beat Roku before he took down the temple.
I don't think anybody could have beaten the Avatar in that moment. The Avatar, and we talk about this a little bit later, the Avatar is so overwhelmingly powerful that Avatar Roku could have won even more than just fire as well. Anyways, we also see everyone arrived at the Fire Temple, and the Fire Sages attack, even though the Fire Sages are introduced as supposed allies to the Avatar. They have a very strong spiritual connection to the temple, including the Avatar. But as Shai, you alluded to, the sages abandoned hope, and their loyalties changed when they realized that the new Avatar was not going to return. They lost hope, so they declared their loyalty to the Fire Lord. But then Shai comes to Aang's aid, and he leads him to the sanctuary. And then we see Sokka's intelligence, where we don't really see it ever before in the series, but we see him devise a fake firebending gag to trigger the doors to the sanctuary while the doors don't open. The blast makes it look like Aang actually was inside with the scorch marks, and it shows how smart Sokka is, because although his combat skills are not an asset per se in the series 2 Team Avatar, and neither is his bending, because he can't bend, but his brains really are his contribution to Team Avatar, and that's what makes them that's what gives them such a big edge, is Sokka's intelligence.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of what you said about the Fire Sages basically turning on the Avatar, if these Fire Sages, who are basically in existence to serve the Avatar, turn against him, it just makes you wonder how many, I mean, obviously we know, but how many other members of the Fire Nation, members of other nations, turned against peace and turned against the Avatar because he was gone for 100 years. Like, this entire show is just focused around everybody feeling hopeless for 100 years.
Yeah, that's true. And who knows how many people around the world felt hopeless like the Fire Sages did, and they just abandoned hope and just declare their loyalty to the Fire Lord instead. But Aang did get into the sanctuary, even with a hiccup towards the end when Zuko actually got into the sanctuary and almost captured Aang. But again, as always, Zuko does not have the capabilities to hold on to Aang once he gets him. And then Aang finally gets into the sanctuary with the doors sealed. And even with the doors sealed, as the Fire Sages and Zuko try to get back into the sanctuary, they cannot get in because clearly Avatar Roku does not want them inside. And then Zhao comes up, somehow evading Zuko's smokescreen because he's just so intelligent. And he plans to fire blast Aang when he leaves the sanctuary. And then this is really also Zhao's first interaction with the Avatar. And Zhao, from the very get-go, once Zhao realizes the Avatar is back, he underestimates him for being a 12-year-old kid who only knows the element of air. But obviously, Zhao does not know who he's dealing with.
And Zhao's his consistency with trying to also get the Avatar on top of Zuko trying to get him, just shows how power hungry Zhao was. Even though Zhao was the admiral of the Fire Nation Navy, he literally couldn't go any higher in the Navy. Who knows what Zhao could have become if his fate didn't happen to him a few episodes later. Honestly, I think he probably even could have rose to the rank of competing with the Fire Lord to become Fire Lord just because of how power hungry he was.
He was very power hungry in this series. So then the epic moment, the takeaway sequence from this episode is undoubtedly when Aang finally meets Avatar Roku, the mentor that he's been seeking, that he's been told about for so long, and Aang finally completes his first mission as the Avatar by talking to Avatar Roku. And he learns about Sozin's Comet, how 100 years ago, Fire Lord Sozin launched his first attack on the world against the other nations by harnessing the power of a comet, making the firebenders stronger than anybody, including the Avatar, can even imagine. And that the comet is coming back at summer's end, and that it will have the power once again to give firebenders all the power in the world to end the war once and for all in the name of the Fire Nation. And Aang realizes that he needs to master the elements, not through years of practice and discipline like the monks taught him, but by the end of the summer, by 6 to 9 months from now. And Aang realizes that he has a big mission on his hands, that the road to victory against the Fire Nation is much more dangerous and threatening than he could have imagined. And then Aang goes into the Avatar state and as Roku, and then he escapes. But in terms of Sozin's Comet, this is our first taste of what Aang actually needs to do. We know that he's the Avatar. Bumi said briefly that his mission is to defeat the Fire Lord Ozai, but we never learn about the Comet until now.
Yeah, and from this conversation, I think we get the single most important and significant quote of the entire series, when Roku says to Aang, "Aang, you must defeat the Fire Lord before the Comet arrives." We hear that quote probably 75 times throughout this entire series, with like the previously and even just other people saying the same exact quote over and over again. This quote alone sets up the entire mission of the entire series. Aang must defeat the Fire Lord before the Comet arrives. That's the entire mission of the entire 3 books.
I also love the intersection of this series to astronomy. There's so much astronomy tied into this show. We can talk about this episode being built on the winter solstice. We have comets. We have eclipses as the show progresses, which becomes very important in this series. I love the factor and the role that astronomy plays in this show as well. So then, Sozin's Comet, we learn about the mission. Aang goes into the Avatar state. Roku helps him escape because he knows that he faces a danger as he escapes the temple. And as Zhao, as Zuko, and Asaka and Katara expect Aang to be blown to smithereens and killed, we see Avatar Roku bending the fire out of the way. And Zhao is the first face of reaction we see, and he can't believe what he's seeing, that Avatar Roku is evading his Fire Nation Navy, The Navy's blown away, Zuko escapes, the temple sent into destruction. It's a miraculous, chaotic scene which I love to watch because it shows how powerful the Avatar really is. Beyond any feasible reason, a 12-year-old kid can morph into one of his past lives and use fire, which is something Aang does not even know anything about yet. Aang could go into another past life on impulsive reaction whenever he's in danger, because not the first time or the last time that he goes as one of his past lives in this series at all. And I love seeing Zhao angry that he escaped the situation without Aang or Prince Zuko. And he just sends all the fire sages to the Fire Lord to be punished, even though Shai-Yu is the only person who actually committed treason.
Yeah, and this is the first and only time that somebody who's not the Avatar sees a previous life in the flesh. Because I don't know if it was a mistake of the creators that they didn't include this later on, but I take that back. We do see Kyoshi for a little tiny while in book 2. But this and that are the only two occasions when people who are not the Avatar and don't have links to the Avatar in the spirit world can actually see previous lives instead of just seeing the current life. We also see Roku lava bending. I don't know if you caught on to that, but he's literally lava bending the lava. He makes a crack in the ground and then shoots the lava through. This is the only time we see lava bending until The Legend of Korra. And then we also see that obviously Roku's not the first person to lava bend. The two fire avatars before him lava bend. This is talked about in the Kyoshi novels, and that person was the first lava bender. So, but the thing is, to lava bend, you have to be the utmost master in firebending and earthbending, actually, because we see Bolin in The Legend of Korra lava bending, and that's an earthbending trait, somewhat firebending. But it shows that how much of a master of bending Roku was. Roku's probably one of the strongest and most powerful benders of any Avatar ever.
And I was actually going to mention, I remember watching the series, and I remember how Shai-Yu talked about how the temple was carved by Roku bending the magma. And obviously it does come up in The Legend of Korra that lava is a bendable element, but it doesn't really... I think it slips through the cracks for the Avatar creators because we don't really learn about Roku's background in lava bending or any of the other firebenders for that matter. Lava bending is pretty much obscure and obsolete until Bolin learns it in The Legend of Korra. And I'm also curious because it is a mix of earth and fire. How do you learn lava bending? How do you learn that you have it? And how it's the only real style of bending that you can learn as a member of two different cultures in this universe as well. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I just find it... So, talking about Bolin in The Legend of Korra, I believe that he was able to lava bend because he was an earthbender. Because lava bending at its core is an earthbending trait. But since his brother's name was Mako, right? Mako was a firebender, so that means one of his parents was fire, one of their parents was earthbending. So Bolin got the earthbending trait, I don't know from which parent, but he also got a little bit of the firebending. But what I find most interesting is, apart from Bolin and apart from that other guy who was chasing with Zahir in Legend of Korra, I know that's very far down the road.
His name is Ghazan.
Ghazan, there you go. But apart from those two, the only time we ever hear about lava bending benders are Roku and Zito, Avatar Zito. It might actually not, I don't think it's Avatar Zito. It's the Avatar firebending Avatar before Zito. Zito was before Kyoshi. It's very, very confusing. I wish we can have visuals and have a map of all these avatars. But before Bolin and before, what's the guy's name again?
Mako.
Mako, the guy with
Ghazan.
Ghazan. Before those two, we only ever see firebending avatars do it, even though lava bending is an earth-bending trait. I just find that so interesting because even though Roku, he's probably strongest in firebending, he's able to do a master part of earthbending.
And the final shot, going back to Avatar episode 8, the final shot we see is Appa flying into the moon after a very long and stressful day, and Aang is facing away from Katara and Sokka, and he's visibly lost, and he's really scared. It's a painting that paints 1,000 words, because Aang was this innocent little kid. He was just doing his thing. He took a nap, and then he wakes up 100 years later. All of his friends are gone. His entire culture is wiped out. The war is engulfed into a huge and deadly war on the verge of defeat to the Fire Nation. And now he learns he needs to defeat the Fire Lord in just a few months and learn all the 3 elements and master them in time to beat the Fire Lord and win the war.
And I mean, no Avatar before Aang, from our knowledge and from everything that we could gather from all the other Avatars, none of them had to do this in any sort of time. No previous Avatar had this crazy thing happening in the world that forced them to learn quick. I mean, yes, some Avatars did learn the elements quick. I mean, Kyoshi learned somewhat quick with the elements. So did Korra. She actually learned almost all of them except airbending before she was even 16, which is insane. But they didn't really have to do that. But Aang, he was forced to learn them in just a matter of months. And you could say that he mastered all of them in a matter of months.
That he did. Spoiler alert. But anyways, that is the end of chapters 7 and 8, the 2-part winter solstice episode. It's a very defining 2-parter in the series. Personally, I think part 2 is epic. I think it's got a lot of epic sequences. I love this. I love the sequence of Team Avatar sailing past the blockade, getting into the Fire Nation water. I love the scene where Aang finally gets into the temple and meets Avatar Roku. And I love the scene where we see Avatar Roku help Aang escape and pretty much destroy the temple and send everybody running from the Avatar. It's an epic episode, and I love it. And it sets the stage for what Aang needs to do in the next episode, which is finally start waterbending and learning waterbending. So that is the end of this episode. Next time you hear from us, we'll be talking about the next 2 episodes of Avatar State of Mind, Chapter 9, The Waterbending Scroll, and Chapter 10, Jet. That'll be fun. I can't wait to talk about Jet, another one of Katara's suitors.
Oh God, Jet. Jet, the one character who I think was not done justice.
Well, we'll hear more about that next episode. Thank you very much for tuning in once again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Avatar State of Mind. We'll be back next Saturday with episode 7. Follow us on Instagram at Avatar State of Mind and Twitter at AvatarSOM for more content and to get sneak peeks at episodes before they release. If you have any recommendations for a future episode, please tweet us or comment on any of our Instagram posts. For Sam DeCoste, I am Aaron Miller. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Avatar State of Mind.